The waitress handed her final bill to a crying boy abandoned at the bus stop, not knowing the vampire king stood 3 feet behind her, hidden in shadow. What she didn't know, vampire law considered unsolicited charity a blood debt. His voice cut through the rain, soft, amused, and absolute. You just bought something you can't afford. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The dawn broke gray and cold over streets that still held the night's rain in slick black pools, and Maya Reyes stood at the corner of 5th and Brennan with her apron still tied around her waist, and the smell of burnt coffee and fryer grease soaked so deep into the fabric it had become a second skin. Her shift had ended 20 minutes ago, but the bus she needed wouldn't come for another 15, and her feet ached in the kind of way that made every step feel like a negotiation between bone and pavement. She was thinking about her bed, about the 3 deadbolts on her apartment door, about the stack of bills rubber-banded together on her kitchen counter when she saw the boy. He sat alone on the bench at the bus stop across the street, small and hunched, clutching a torn backpack to his chest like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. He was crying, not the loud hiccuping sobs of a child throwing a tantrum, but the quiet kind that meant he'd been crying for a while and had run out of the energy for noise. Maya stopped. She looked left, then right, scanning for a parent, a guardian, anyone who might be responsible for a kid that young sitting alone as the city woke up around him. The street was empty except for a black limousine idling half a block down, its engine a low purr that she could feel more than hear. She looked back at the boy. He couldn't have been more than 7, his jacket too thin for the cold, his sneakers worn through at the toes. Maya's hand went to her pocket, felt the shape of her wallet, the single $20 bill inside that was supposed to last her until Friday when her paycheck cleared. She did the math in her head, the same math she did every week. Rent was $450, due in 3 days. She had $227 in her account. The 20 in her pocket was supposed to cover the gap, along with the 10 she'd get from returning bottles, and the maybe 15 she could borrow from Liz if Liz wasn't still mad about last month. Without the 20 she'd be short, and Mrs. Chen didn't do payment plans. Maya looked at the boy again, at his thin shoulders shaking, at the way his fingers gripped the backpack straps white-knuckle tight, and she thought about being 7 and scared, and alone. She thought about the bus stop near the trailer park where she grew up, about sitting there in the rain waiting for her mom to remember to pick her up from school. She crossed the street. Her feet hurt less when she had a purpose. The boy didn't look up when she approached, didn't acknowledge her presence even when her shadow fell across his lap. She knelt down on the wet pavement, felt the cold seep through the knee of her jeans, and spoke quietly so she wouldn't startle him. "I know what it's like," she said. "Find someone safe, okay?" She pulled the 20 from her wallet, pressed it into his small, cold palm, and closed his fingers around it gently. He looked up then, his face streaked with tears, his eyes too wide and too dark for a child that young. But he didn't speak. Maya stood, her knees protesting, and turned away before she could think too hard about what she'd just done, before the panic of being short on rent could catch up with her better instincts. She walked toward her apartment 3 blocks east, shoulders hunched against the wind that cut down the avenue, already mentally cataloging what she could sell or skip or do without. She didn't look back. She didn't see the boy's tears stop instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. She didn't see him turn his head toward the black limousine idling down the street, his expression shifting from anguish to blank neutrality in the span of a heartbeat. She didn't see the way he stood, dropped the backpack, and dissolved into shadow, his small form collapsing into smoke that scattered on the wind and left nothing behind but the empty bench and the $20 bill fluttering to the wet pavement. Inside the limousine, Constantine sat perfectly still in the back seat, his hands folded in his lap, his dark eyes fixed on the woman walking away down the avenue. He had not moved since the car had pulled to a stop 20 minutes ago, had not blinked, had barely breathed. His driver, Victor, shifted in the front seat and spoke in a low voice that barely carried over the hum of the engine. "Sir," he said, "the test is concluded. Shall we follow standard protocol?" Constantine raised one hand, a minimal gesture, fingers lifting an inch from his knee. "Wait," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that made people lean in to listen. "I want to see where she goes when she thinks no one is watching." Victor nodded and said nothing more. The limousine's engine purred, a predator's breath in the cold morning air. Constantine watched the woman turn the corner at the end of the block, watched her disappear from view, and only then did he allow himself to lean back against the leather seat. His fingers tapped once against the armrest, a single deliberate motion. Recognition. In 300 years of searching, of testing, of watching humanity reduce mercy to performance art and charity to tax write-offs, he had seen 57 people encounter the boy at various locations throughout the city. 56 had failed. They had ignored him, photographed him for social media, called the authorities to have him removed from sight, or offered help only when others were watching. This woman, this waitress, with grease-stained clothes and exhaustion written in every line of her body, had given her last $20 to a stranger with no audience, no witnesses, no expectation of recognition or reward. She had knelt on wet pavement and spoken to the boy like he mattered. She had walked away before he could even thank her. Constantine's expression remained unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of something that might have been hope, or might have been hunger, or might have been both. The sun crept higher, turning the gray sky to pale yellow. A distant siren wailed and faded. The bus stop bench sat empty beneath a flickering street lamp, its light unnecessary now in the growing dawn. The bench's back panel held a faded advertisement for a bail bondsman, the phone number half scraped away by weather and time. Across the street, a newspaper tumbled end over end in the wind. The smell of wet pavement and exhaust hung heavy in the air. Victor glanced in the rearview mirror, waiting for instructions. Constantine continued to stare at the corner where the woman had disappeared, his face carved from stillness. "Follow her," he said finally. "Keep distance. I want to know where she lives, where she works, who she calls when she's afraid." Victor put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, smooth and silent. The limousine moved through the empty streets like a shark through dark water, keeping 2 blocks behind as the woman walked home. Constantine watched her through the tinted windows, watched the way she kept her head down, the way she pulled her jacket tighter against the wind, the way she stopped once to look back over her shoulder as if sensing she was being observed, then shook her head and kept walking. She climbed the steps of a building that leaned slightly to the left, its brick facade stained with decades of rain and neglect. She unlocked a door and disappeared inside. The limousine glided past and turned the corner. Victor parked in an alley with a clear sightline to her building's entrance. He waited for Constantine to speak. The sun was fully up now, pale and cold. Constantine pulled a phone from his jacket pocket, opened an encrypted messaging application, and typed a brief message. "The test subject has been identified," he wrote. "Proceed to Phase 2. Initiate contact protocol within 12 hours. He sent the message and set the phone aside. His hands returned to his lap, fingers laced together. "Maya Reyes," he said aloud, testing the shape of her name. He had read her file before the test, knew her history, her debts, her failures and small victories. But files were abstractions. What he had just witnessed was something else entirely. It was proof. And in his world, proof was worth more than blood, more than gold, more than the centuries of precedent that governed every interaction between his kind and hers. Victor remained silent, patient. Constantine continued to watch the building where Maya had disappeared. She would receive the summons tonight. She would be afraid. She would come anyway because she had no choice, because covenant law was older than the city around them and infinitely less forgiving. But first, He wanted to see what she did in the hours between the gift and the reckoning. He wanted to see if her kindness had been an anomaly or a pattern. He wanted to see if she would look at that empty wallet and regret her choice. The morning traffic began to thicken. People emerged from buildings, hunched against the cold, rushing toward trains and buses and jobs that ground them down one shift at a time. Constantine watched them all and felt nothing. But when he thought of the woman kneeling on wet pavement to comfort a stranger's child, when he replayed the moment she pressed that $20 bill into a small palm and asked for nothing in return, he felt the faintest echo of something he had not felt in decades. It might have been respect. It might have been curiosity. It might have been the dangerous beginning of hope that the covenant his kind had sworn to uphold still had meaning in a world that had forgotten why it was written. "Wait here," he told Victor. "I'll return before sunset." He opened the door and stepped out into the cold morning, his coat settling around him like folded wings. He walked toward the building where Maya slept, not to enter, but to stand beneath her window and listen to the city wake. Somewhere above, she was counting her losses and trying to convince herself she'd done the right thing. Somewhere above, she had no idea her life had just changed in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. The test was over. The real trial was about to begin. Maya climbed the stairs to her apartment, counting each step out loud, because if she focused on the numbers, she wouldn't have to think about the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, or the fact that she'd just given away grocery money to a kid who probably had better resources than she did. 23, 24, 25. The building smelled like mildew and someone's burned dinner, the carpet worn through to backing in the high-traffic areas, the walls a yellow that might have been white 2 decades ago. 26, 27, 28. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor at the end of a hallway where the light bulb had been out for 6 weeks, and nobody cared enough to replace it. She fumbled for her keys in the dark, unlocked the first deadbolt, then the second, then the third, each one a small ritual of safety that she performed twice a day, every day, because she'd learned early that locks only worked if you actually used them. The door swung open, and she stepped into the studio apartment that was barely larger than a parking space, kicked off her shoes without untying them, and let them fall wherever they landed. The futon was unmade, sheets tangled, a pillow without a case shoved against the wall. Bills covered the surface of the folding table that served as both desk and dining area. White envelopes and pink final notices and red threats of disconnection arranged in neat stacks, because if she couldn't pay them, at least she could organize them. She collapsed onto the futon and felt every muscle in her body release at once, the kind of exhaustion that went bone deep and made even breathing feel like work. The ceiling above her had a water stain in the shape of something that might have been a map of a country that didn't exist, brown edges spreading slowly year by year. The single window faced a brick wall 3 feet away, close enough that she could reach out and touch it if she opened the glass, which she never did because the window didn't lock properly, and this was not a neighborhood where you left vulnerabilities unguarded. The refrigerator hummed its dying mechanical song in the corner, a sound she'd stopped hearing months ago except in moments like this, when everything else went quiet. She pulled out her phone and opened her banking app, watched the numbers load with the sick dread of someone checking test results they knew would be bad. $227 in checking. Rent was $450, due in 3 days. She opened her calculator and started the math she'd already done a dozen times. $227, plus the 10 from bottle returns if she spent tomorrow morning digging through recycling bins, plus maybe 15 from Liz if Liz had forgiven her for borrowing money last month and forgetting to pay it back. That put her at $252. She needed $450. She was $198 short. Without the 20 she'd given away, she'd have been $178 short, which was still impossible but felt less impossible in the way that smaller numbers always did. She closed the calculator and opened her email, scrolling through job listings she'd already applied to, gig work that paid less than minimum wage, offers for credit cards she wouldn't qualify for. Her thumb hovered over a listing for plasma donation, $50 for the first visit, when something slid under her door. The sound was soft, just paper on linoleum, but in the silence of her apartment it might as well have been a gunshot. Maya sat up, every nerve suddenly alert. She stared at the door, at the gap beneath it where light from the hallway bled through, and watched as a black envelope came to rest against the baseboard. No footsteps, no knock. Just the envelope, lying there like it had materialized out of nothing. She stood slowly, crossed the room in 3 steps, and picked it up. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind of stock that cost more per sheet than she made in an hour. It was sealed with red wax, an actual wax seal, like something from a period drama, stamped with a symbol she didn't recognize. No address, no postage, no name. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the way it seemed to pull at her fingers. She broke the seal and slid out a card, cream-colored with raised black lettering that caught the light. Your attendance is required. Tonight. Midnight. The Constant Tower. Transportation will be provided. Refusal is not permitted under Covenant Law, Section 9. No signature, no explanation, no phone number to call for questions. The card smelled faintly of copper and old paper, the kind of smell that libraries had before they went digital. And underneath that, something else, something organic and slightly sweet that made her stomach turn. Maya's hands went cold. She read the card again, searching for some indication that this was a joke or a scam or a mistake, but the cardstock was too expensive for a prank, and the wax seal too elaborate for anything random. The Constant Tower. Everyone in the city had heard of it. The glass and steel monolith that rose from the financial district like a knife pointing at the sky, the building that didn't appear on any tour guide and didn't rent office space and was surrounded by the kind of security that made people cross to the other side of the street. She'd never known anyone who'd been inside. She'd never known anyone who knew anyone who'd been inside. Covenant Law, Section 9. She grabbed her phone and typed the phrase into a search engine, waited for results that never came. Nothing. Not a Wikipedia article, not a conspiracy forum, not even a Reddit thread. She tried variations. Covenant Law, Section 9. The Constant Tower. Each search returned either nothing or results so generic they were useless. She called her building Super, let it ring 8 times before hanging up. She called Liz, her only real friend from the diner, and got voicemail. Her voice shook when she spoke. Liz, if you get this, something weird is happening. There's a car outside. If I'm not at work tomorrow, call someone. I don't know who. Just call someone. She hung up and immediately regretted how dramatic she sounded, but when she looked at the card again, the regret evaporated. Refusal is not permitted. She tried a crisis hotline, the kind advertised on bus benches, and got a recording saying their hours were 9 to 5 on weekdays. She paced the length of her apartment, which took 4 steps, then paced back. Her thumbnail went to her mouth and she chewed it without thinking, tasted blood, kept chewing. She changed her shirt, then changed it again, trying to figure out what you wore to a midnight summons from people who used wax seals and referenced laws that didn't exist online. She settled on jeans and a black sweater, the nicest thing she owned that didn't smell like fryer grease. The clock on her phone read 11:34. She had 13 minutes. She could run. The thought arrived fully formed, seductive in its simplicity. Pack a bag, climb out the window, disappear into the city. But she had $27 and no car and nowhere to go that couldn't be found by someone who knew her name and address. She could ignore it. Stay in her apartment with the deadbolts locked and wait for morning. But the card had said refusal was not permitted, and something about the phrasing made her believe that the people who wrote it were not accustomed to being disobeyed. She stuffed pepper spray in her jacket pocket, the little canister Liz had given her last Christmas, and pulled out a notepad. She wrote quickly, her handwriting barely legible. If I don't come back, check my phone. Called crisis line at 11:35. Black car outside at midnight. The Constant Tower. She left the note on the table where her neighbor Mrs. Kim would see it if she had to use the spare key Maya had given her for emergencies. She put her phone in her other pocket, made sure it was charged, turned on location tracking, even though she had no idea if it would work where she was going. The clock read 11:43. Outside her window, through the gap between her building and the brick wall, she could see a slice of street. A black limousine sat at the curb, engine running, exhaust rising in pale clouds. It looked too clean for this neighborhood, too pristine, like a hearse that had taken a wrong turn and ended up somewhere hearses didn't belong. Maya stood at her door with her hand on the knob, thumb on the first deadbolt. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to barricade herself, to treat this like the threat it obviously was. But underneath the fear was something else, something that felt like curiosity or fatalism, or maybe just the exhausted acceptance that came from a life where bad things happened, whether you invited them or not. She unlocked the deadbolts one by one, stepped into the hallway, locked the door behind her. The building was quiet, everyone asleep or pretending to be, the kind of silence that made you aware of your own breathing. She walked down the stairs counting again, 28, 27, 26, her hand trailing along the railing. The front door opened onto a street wrapped in fog, thick and low-lying, rolling between streetlights like something alive. The limousine waited. As she approached, the rear door opened and a man in a dark suit stepped out, not to greet her but simply to hold the door, his face professionally blank. "Miss Reyes," he said, his voice polite and utterly immovable. "We've been waiting." Maya looked at him, then at the open door, then back at her building where a single light burned in a third-floor window, her window. She'd left it on. Some part of her had assumed she'd be coming back. She climbed into the limousine because there was nowhere else to go, and because the man holding the door looked like he would stand there all night if necessary, and because she'd given her last $20 to a stranger at dawn, and maybe this was what the universe sent in return. The door closed behind her with the soft click of expensive engineering. The interior smelled like leather and something faintly metallic. The driver pulled away from the curb without a word, and Maya watched her building disappear into the fog, watched her whole small life recede into darkness, and wondered if the note she'd left would be enough for anyone to find her if she never came back. The city slid past the tinted windows, streetlights smearing into long streaks of yellow and red. She couldn't see where they were going. She couldn't see anything except her own reflection in the glass, pale and small and frightened, a woman who'd made a choice at dawn and was about to discover what it cost. The limousine turned off the main road onto a private drive that Maya hadn't noticed existed, the kind of street that seemed to materialize out of nowhere, rising at an angle steep enough that she felt herself pressed back into the leather seat. The city fell away below them, lights scattering into a glittering grid, and ahead through the tinted windshield, she saw the Constant Tower for the first time up close, a monolith of glass and steel that caught the moonlight and threw it back in sharp angles, a building that looked less constructed than grown, organic and wrong in the way it seemed to defy the basic geometry of architecture. It rose 50 stories straight up without taper or ornament, each floor identical to the last, windows dark except for scattered lights that burned in patterns she couldn't decode. The limousine glided to a stop beneath a canopy of brushed steel, and the driver came around to open her door without a word. Maya stepped out into air so cold it hurt to breathe, looked up at the tower looming above her, and felt her stomach drop. This was real. Whatever this was, it was real. The driver gestured toward glass doors that slid open silently, and she walked through them, because turning back now would mean admitting she'd made a mistake by coming, and she wasn't ready to admit that yet. The lobby was a cathedral of black marble and gold inlay, the floor polished to a mirror shine, the walls rising 30 feet to a ceiling embedded with lights that cast no shadows, just a uniform glow that made everything look slightly unreal. Guards stood at intervals along the perimeter, men and women in tailored suits with earpieces and hands clasped behind their backs, no visible weapons but something in their posture that suggested weapons were unnecessary. They didn't look at her as she passed, but she felt their attention like pressure on her skin. A woman appeared from a hallway to the left, her heels clicking against marble, her charcoal gray suit so precisely fitted it looked painted on. She was perhaps 40, perhaps younger, with dark hair pulled back in a style that revealed sharp cheekbones and eyes that assessed Maya in a single sweep and found her wanting. "Miss Reyes," the woman said. Not a question. Please follow me. She turned without waiting for confirmation and walked toward an elevator bank, her stride efficient and unhurried. Maya followed because there was nothing else to do, her sneakers squeaking softly against marble, the sound embarrassingly loud in the vast silence. The elevator was mirrored on all sides and rose so smoothly she couldn't tell they were moving until her ears popped. The woman didn't speak. Maya counted floors on the display, watched the numbers climb, tried to steady her breathing. They stopped at 47. The doors opened onto a corridor lined with doors of frosted glass, each identical, each unmarked. The woman led her to the third door on the right, opened it, and stepped aside. This way, she said, and Maya entered a room that made her breath catch. It was small, maybe 10 feet square, the walls lined floor to ceiling with mirrors edged in silver filigree so delicate it looked like frost. A single chair sat in the center facing a door of frosted glass that revealed only vague shadows moving beyond. A small table beside the chair held nothing. Recessed lighting came from everywhere and nowhere, casting no shadows, and the air was cold enough that Maya could see her breath in small clouds. Please sit, the woman said, and Maya sat because her legs were shaking, and sitting seemed better than falling. The chair was bolted to the floor. She discovered this when she tried to shift it closer to the table, and it didn't move. The woman set a leather folder on the table, the kind lawyers used, burgundy with gold clasps. She opened it to reveal papers covered in dense text, handwritten in ink that seemed to shift color when Maya looked at it directly, black from one angle and deep red from another. My name is Victoria, the woman said, her voice as precise as her suit. I serve as attaché to the Vampire King. You are here because you triggered an ancient protection right this morning at approximately 6:15. Maya opened her mouth to speak, but Victoria continued without pause. The child you encountered was a blood-marked dependent under the king's protection. By offering unsolicited aid at personal cost with no expectation of reward or witness, you invoked Covenant Law, Section 9, Subsection 3. The Vampire King is now bound by ancient precedent to repay your kindness 100-fold, or to bind you into his house as kin. These are the only options permitted under the law. Refusal voids the protections afforded to both parties. Maya's head spun. The child was a test, she said, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. Victoria's expression didn't change. The Vampire King does not make mistakes, Miss Reyes. The child was a test. You passed. That comes with consequences. She tapped the folder with one manicured finger. You have two options. Option A is a cash payment of $200,000 transferred to an account of your choosing, along with a minor memory alteration to remove all knowledge of this night and the events that preceded it. You would wake tomorrow in your apartment, with no recollection of the summons, the tower, or this conversation. The money would appear to be an inheritance from a distant relative. You would be free to live your life as you see fit. Maya stared at the paper, at the number written there in that shifting ink. $200,000. More money than she'd ever imagined having. Enough to pay rent for years, to quit the diner, to start over somewhere new. And all it would cost was forgetting. Victoria turned the page. Option B is refusal of payment and acceptance of a year-long binding as a protected dependent of the king's house. You would reside here in the constant tower under his protection. You would be provided shelter, sustenance, and safety from all threats, mundane and otherwise. In exchange, you would serve a role within the household, the specifics of which would be determined by the king himself. At the end of 1 year, the binding dissolves and you are free to leave with no memory alteration and no further obligation. She paused, her eyes meeting Maya's for the first time. The cost of option B is a debt. You would owe the king a favor to be named and called at his discretion, either during the year of binding or after. The nature of this debt is unspecified. Refusal to honor it would result in immediate termination of all protections and consequences I am not authorized to detail. Maya looked at the contract, at the two options laid out in handwriting that seemed alive, and felt the walls closing in. The mirrors showed her face from 8 angles, pale and frightened, dark circles under her eyes, hair still pulled back in the ponytail she'd tied 12 hours ago for her shift. "What if I don't sign either?" she said. Victoria closed the folder with a soft sound like a door shutting. "Then you leave this building in violation of covenant reciprocity. We cannot protect you from what that attracts." The words hung in the cold air. Maya's mind raced through possibilities, through escape routes and legal defenses and rational explanations for what was happening, and came up empty every time. Vampires. The woman had said Vampire King without irony or hesitation, had said it the way someone might say mayor or governor, a simple statement of fact. Maya had grown up on stories, on movies and books and late-night cable, but those were fiction, and this was a woman in a tailored suit offering her a contract in a room lined with mirrors 47 floors above a city that suddenly felt very far away. "What attracts?" Maya said. Victoria was already moving toward the door. "Things that hunt," she said. "Things that would see your unmarked presence in the king's territory as an invitation. Things I am not authorized to describe in detail, but which you would not survive encountering unprepared." She paused with her hand on the door. "You have 5 minutes to decide. There is a pen in the folder. Mark your choice on the signature line, and leave the folder on the table. Someone will come for you." The door opened and closed, and Maya was alone. The silence was so complete she could hear her pulse in her ears, could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system, could hear her own breathing loud and ragged. She looked at the mirrors, at her reflection multiplied and inescapable, and thought about the boy at the bus stop. His tears had been real. She was sure of that. The cold of his hand when she'd pressed the money into his palm had been real. But Victoria had called him blood-marked, had called him a test. And Maya didn't know what that meant except that her kindness had been observed and measured and found sufficient to trigger laws she didn't understand. $200,000. She could take it. Sign the paper, submit to whatever they meant by memory alteration, wake up tomorrow with a bank account that would change her life. She'd forget the fear, forget this room, forget the sinking certainty that she'd stumbled into something vast and old, that operated by rules she couldn't begin to comprehend. She'd be safe. Or she could stay. Accept the binding. Live in this tower for a year. Owe a debt to a vampire king whose face she hadn't seen and whose motives she couldn't guess. She'd be trapped, but she'd remember. She'd know. And maybe that mattered more than safety. Maya opened the folder and found the pen, heavy and cold, made of something that looked like silver. The contract was 3 pages of dense text she didn't have time to read carefully. Clauses and subclauses written in language that sounded legal and archaic at once. She skimmed, catching phrases. Binding of blood and word, protection absolute within the bounds of the king's domain, forfeiture of prior residence and employment. Debt uncollected bears interest in kind. She didn't understand half of it. At the bottom of the 3rd page were 2 lines, one labeled Option A and one labeled Option B, with a space for her signature beside each. Her hand shook as she put the pen to paper. She thought about her apartment, about the futon and the stained ceiling and the refrigerator that hummed itself to sleep. She thought about the diner, about Liz, about the life she'd built from scraps and willpower. She thought about the $20 and the way the boy had looked at her, those 2 dark eyes in a too small face. If she took the money and forgot, it would be like it never happened. The kindness would evaporate, unmemoried, and she'd go back to being someone who counted pennies and made hard choices, and sometimes, on good days, broke even. But if she stayed, if she signed Option B, she'd be choosing to remember, choosing to step into whatever this was with her eyes open, choosing to matter in a way that terrified her. She wrote Option B on the signature line, her handwriting barely legible, and sat back. Her hands were shaking so hard the pen fell from her fingers and clattered on the table. The mirrors showed her 8 versions of the same moment, 8 Mayas who'd just signed away, a year of their lives to people who used words like blood-marked and covenant law, and spoke about vampires the way normal people spoke about the weather. The frosted glass door showed movement beyond, shadows shifting, waiting. Maya folded her hands in her lap to stop the shaking and stared at the contract. "What kind of debt?" she'd asked Victoria. "The kind you'll understand when it's called," Victoria had said, already at the door, already gone. The room was so cold Maya's teeth chattered. The silence pressed against her eardrums. She counted her heartbeats, trying to slow them, trying to convince herself she'd made the right choice. At 60 seconds the door opened and Victoria returned, picked up the folder without looking at Maya's choice, and nodded once. "Follow me," she said, and Maya stood on legs that barely held her weight, and followed her out of the antechamber, away from the 8 reflected versions of herself, toward whatever waited beyond the frosted glass. The corridor seemed longer on the way back, the elevator slower, the lobby impossibly vast. Victoria led her to a different wing, through doors that required handprints and retinal scans, down hallways where the marble gave way to dark wood paneling, and the lighting shifted from clinical to warm. They stopped at a door of heavy oak, unmarked, and Victoria knocked twice. A voice from within said enter, and Victoria opened the door and stepped aside. "The Vampire King will see you now," she said, and Maya walked through into a room that smelled of old books and something faintly copper, into the presence of something ancient and patient that had been waiting for her since dawn. 3 nights in the constant tower had taught Maya that vampires operated on a different sense of time, that what felt like waiting to her was merely breathing to them, and that when Victoria appeared at her door with a garment bag and instructions to be ready in 1 hour, there was no negotiating the timeline or the terms. The gown was deep green silk that felt like water against her skin, cut lower in the front than anything she'd ever worn, the back open to her shoulder blades, sleeves long and fitted to her wrists. It was too elegant, too expensive, too exposing, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw someone playing dress-up in a life that didn't belong to her. Victoria had done her hair, pulled it back from her face in a style that felt both classic and severe, applied makeup with the efficiency of someone who'd dressed 1,000 people for 1,000 events, and had long since stopped caring whether they felt comfortable. "You will stand when introduced," Victoria said, checking her tablet without looking up. "You will not speak unless directly addressed. You will remain at the king's side unless he indicates otherwise. Do you understand?" Maya understood that she was a prop, a symbol, a thing to be displayed, and the understanding sat in her stomach like lead. The grand hall was on the 40th floor, accessible by a private elevator that opened directly into an antechamber where Constantine waited. He wore black, a suit so perfectly tailored, it looked like it had been grown rather than sewn, his dark hair combed back, his expression unreadable. He looked her over once, his gaze clinical, then nodded. "You look appropriate," he said, which was possibly the least romantic compliment she'd ever received, and somehow exactly what she needed to hear. She wasn't here to be beautiful. She was here to be proof. The doors to the grand hall opened and sound rushed out, the low murmur of 200 conversations happening simultaneously, the clink of crystal, the rustle of expensive fabric moving across marble. Maya stepped through behind Constantine, and the murmur died instantly, 200 vampires turning as one to look at the human who dared enter their space. The hall was Baroque brutality, a room designed to intimidate through beauty, black marble floors polished to a mirror shine, walls rising 30 feet to a vaulted ceiling hung with chandeliers that refracted light through thousands of crystals, breaking it into rainbows that scattered across the crowd like broken ice. The vampires wore formal wear that ranged from modern suits to period pieces that looked lifted from museums, silks and velvets, and brocades in deep jewel tones, and every single one of them looked at Maya like she was either fascinating or offensive, or both. Constantine's hand settled at the small of her back, a touch so light she almost didn't feel it, but it guided her forward into the crowd that parted like water. They walked the length of the hall while Maya tried to keep her breathing steady, tried not to look at the faces turned toward her, the expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt to something that might have been hunger. The chandeliers hummed at a frequency just below hearing, a sound she felt in her teeth. Constantine stopped at the center of the room, his hand leaving her back, and turned to address the assembled court. His voice carried without him raising it, the kind of projection that came from centuries of commanding attention. "I present Maya Reyes," he said, "protected dependent under covenant reciprocity, bound to this house for 1 year by ancient law and mutual agreement. She is under my direct protection. Any action against her is an action against me and will be treated as such." The murmurs started immediately, a rustle of sound that moved through the crowd like wind through trees. Maya caught phrases, heard protected dependent repeated with varying degrees of disbelief, heard covenant reciprocity said like a curse. She kept her chin up, kept her hands still at her sides, even though every instinct screamed at her to wrap her arms around herself, to make herself smaller, to hide. An elder vampire stepped forward from the crowd, tall and silver-haired, wearing a suit that looked Edwardian, his face lined in a way that suggested he'd been turned, old, or had simply lived so long the age had seeped back in. His eyes were pale blue, cold as winter sky, and when he smiled, it didn't reach past his mouth. "Lord Cassius," Constantine said, his voice carrying a warning. "How kind of you to attend." Cassius inclined his head, a gesture that managed to be both polite and mocking. "I would not miss such a historic occasion," he said, his accent British and old, the kind that spoke of landed estates and inherited titles. "A human in the Constant Tower, claimed under covenant law no less. It has been, 70 years since the last such binding." His gaze shifted to Maya, assessed her the way someone might assess livestock. "If she is truly bound, the old laws will recognize her," he said. "If not, well, we shall see what the wine reveals." He produced from somewhere in his jacket a crystal glass filled with dark red liquid, held it up so the light caught it, made it glow like a ruby. "This is not blood," he assured the room, though his smile suggested he wished it were. "It is wine, aged and rare, laced with trace amounts of venom from the constant bloodline, harmless to those truly protected under covenant law, fatal to pretenders." He extended the glass toward Maya. "A simple test," he said, "to prove the binding is genuine, to satisfy the court's entirely reasonable concerns." Maya felt Constantine go still beside her, felt the temperature in the room drop by degrees. She knew without looking that his jaw had tightened, that he was calculating responses, that refusing would imply doubt in his own claim, but accepting would put her at risk in ways she didn't fully understand. The crowd watched, predatory and precise, a single organism waiting to see blood. Maya stepped forward before Constantine could speak, before she could think through all the ways this could go wrong, and took the glass from Cassius's hand. His fingers were cold where they brushed hers, his expression shifting from theatrical concern to genuine interest. She met his pale eyes and lifted the glass in a mock toast. "To old laws and new mistakes," she said, and drank. The wine was bitter, metallic, wrong in ways that had nothing to do with taste, and everything to do with the way it felt going down, like swallowing lightning, like drinking something that wasn't meant for human throats. Maya's vision blurred at the edges, her heart stuttered, and for a moment she was certain she'd made a catastrophic error, that the binding wasn't real or wasn't strong enough, or that Cassius had lied and this was actual poison designed to kill her in front of 200 witnesses. The room went silent. 10 seconds passed. 20. Maya stayed on her feet. Her vision cleared. Her heart settled back into rhythm. The burning in her throat faded to a dull warmth. She handed the empty glass back to Cassius and watched his expression curdle, watched the theatrical concern evaporate into something harder and colder. "Satisfied," she said, her voice steady even though her legs wanted to buckle. Cassius took the glass without a word, his smile gone, his pale eyes narrowed. Constantine's hand settled on her shoulder, brief and subtle, barely a touch, but the room saw it. The crowd saw everything. The murmur that rose was different now, speculative instead of dismissive, and Maya felt the shift like a change in air pressure. Cassius inclined his head, a gesture that held no mockery this time, only acknowledgement of a point conceded. "Welcome to the Constant Tower, Miss Reyes," he said, and melted back into the crowd. Constantine's hand left her shoulder, and he guided her through the parting crowd toward a door at the far end of the hall, his pace controlled but purposeful, and Maya followed because her legs were shaking too hard to do anything else. They stepped through the door onto a glass balcony that cantilevered out from the building, suspended 50 stories above the city with no visible supports, just a platform of reinforced glass and a railing of brushed steel. The wind hit her immediately, cold and sharp, cutting through the thin silk of her gown. Below, the city sprawled like dying embers, streetlights and building lights reduced to pinpricks, the whole vast sprawl of humanity compressed into a glittering grid. Constantine closed the door behind them, and the sound from the hall cut off completely, leaving only wind and the distant sound of traffic far below. "That was reckless," he said, his voice low and tight in a way she hadn't heard before. Maya leaned against the railing because standing without support felt impossible, her hands gripping the cold steel to stop the shaking. "I know," she said, "but if I let you fight all my battles, I'm just a prop." He moved to stand beside her, hands gripping the railing, knuckles white with tension. "You could have died," he said. That whine. If the binding hadn't taken, if the venom concentration was higher than he claimed, if any of a dozen variables had shifted. Maya laughed, a short, bitter sound. "But it did," she said. "So either your magic works, or I'm lucky. Either way, I'm still here." Constantine turned to look at her, and something in his expression had shifted. The careful control cracked enough that she could see frustration, and something that might have been fear. "Luck runs out, Miss Reyes," he said. Maya met his gaze. "So does patience," she said. "How long do I have?" He looked back out at the city, his profile sharp against the lights below. "2 weeks," he said. "Maybe less." The purists are already mobilizing, calling emergency councils, arguing that your presence here proves I've grown weak and sentimental. The modernists see you as ammunition, proof that the covenant is outdated and impossible to maintain in the modern world. And the silent court, well, they take contracts from anyone with sufficient payment, and there are many who would pay handsomely to see you removed before you become too established a symbol. Maya's hands stopped shaking, replaced by a cold clarity that settled in her chest. "Why don't you just send me home?" she said. "Put me back in my apartment. Give me the money. Make this all go away." Constantine was quiet for a long time, staring out at the city like he was reading futures in the pattern of lights. "Because I gave my word," he said finally. "And because you gave $20 to a stranger at dawn when you had 21 reasons not to. Because every human I've tested over the past decade failed, and you didn't. And that matters more than politics or safety or common sense. Because if I cannot prove that humans like you still exist, the covenant will dissolve and everything it protects will evaporate, and I am not ready to watch that happen." He turned to face her fully, his dark eyes catching the light. "Because you drank poison wine to avoid being my prop, and that kind of reckless defiance is exactly why my kind swore to protect yours in the first place." Maya looked at him, at this ancient thing in a tailored suit who'd tested 57 people to find one who still believed in kindness without audience, and felt something shift between them, some understanding that had nothing to do with contracts or debts or magical bindings. The wind cut through her gown and she shivered, her skin breaking out in goosebumps. Constantine shrugged out of his jacket and draped it over her shoulders without asking, the fabric still warm from his body, even though his skin ran cool. 2 weeks, she said. What happens in 2 weeks? He looked out at the city again. Either you'll be dead, or you'll have survived long enough that killing you becomes more trouble than it's worth, he said. Either the factions will make their move, or they'll accept that the binding is real, and you're here to stay. Either way, the next 2 weeks will determine whether the Covenant survives another century or dies with you. No pressure, Maya said, and Constantine's mouth curved in that brief, almost smile she was learning to recognize. No pressure at all, he agreed, and they stood together on the glass balcony while the wind howled and the city glittered below, and somewhere in the grand hall behind them, 200 vampires calculated how best to kill a human who'd drunk poison and lived. Victoria had escorted Maya from the balcony to the 32nd floor without speaking, their footsteps echoing in hallways that seemed to stretch longer after midnight. And when she opened a door marked only with a number, 327, Maya stepped into a room that looked like a cell dressed up as a bedroom. The space was small, maybe 12 by 15 feet, walls painted white with no decoration. A bed pushed against one wall with white linens so crisp they looked like they'd never been slept in. A single window showed only sky, no view of the city or the ground, just darkness and the occasional passing cloud lit from below by the city's ambient glow. A lamp with warm light sat on a small table beside the bed. A door to the left led to a bathroom, tiled in white subway tile. The door she'd entered through had a lock on the inside, a heavy deadbolt that looked new. "This is yours for the duration of your stay," Victoria had said, setting a keycard on the table. "The door locks from the inside only. The king wanted you to feel secure." Then she'd left, her heels clicking away down the hall, and Maya had stood in the center of the room listening to the silence that was so complete, it felt like pressure in her ears. She peeled off the green gown with shaking hands, let it pool on the floor like spilled paint, stripped down to her underwear, because the silk had made her skin feel wrong, like she was wrapped in someone else's life. She found a t-shirt in the small dresser, oversized and soft, probably left there by whoever prepared the room, and pulled it on. Then she sat on the floor because standing felt impossible, her back against the bed frame, her knees pulled to her chest, and finally let herself shake. The tremors started in her hands and spread to her shoulders, her whole body vibrating with the adrenaline crash she'd been holding off since Cassius had handed her that glass of wine. She'd drunk poison. She'd stood in a room full of predators and drunk actual poison, because refusing would have made her a prop, and accepting proved she was either brave or stupid, or both. The wine had burned going down, had felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate, like swallowing broken glass or lightning, and for those 20 seconds, while the room watched and waited, she'd been certain she was dying. But she hadn't died. The binding had held. Whatever magic or law or ancient contract Constantine had invoked when she signed that paper had been real enough to keep vampire venom from stopping her heart. Maya laughed, a short, breathless sound that echoed in the quiet room, and pressed her forehead to her knees. She thought about the bus stop, about the boy with the torn backpack and the two dark eyes. She thought about the $20 bill she'd pressed into his cold palm, about walking away before he could thank her, about the choice that had felt small at the time and had turned out to be the choice that rewired her entire life. She wondered if kindness was always this expensive, if every act of helping someone cost more than you could afford to pay, if the universe kept receipts and demanded payment with interest. The shaking slowed, then stopped. Maya's breathing evened out. She sat on the floor of her white room and listened to the silence and felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness, the kind of exhaustion that came from fear sustained too long. A soft knock at the door made her flinch. She pulled herself to her feet, wobbled for a moment, then crossed to the door and looked through the peephole. Constantine stood in the hallway, still in his black suit, but with the tie loosened, the top button of his shirt undone, looking somehow less formal and more human than he had in the grand hall. His hands held a tray. Maya unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. "May I?" he said, his voice quiet. She stepped aside and he entered, set the tray on the small table beside the lamp. Steam rose from a ceramic teapot, chipped at the spout but clean. A plate held sliced bread and a glass jar of honey, the kind with the comb still inside. 2 cups, both mismatched, both looking like they'd been used and loved and used again. He didn't sit, didn't make any move to stay, just set down the tray and stepped back. Maya stared at the food, at the simplicity of it. The bread still warm enough that she could smell yeast, the honey golden in the lamplight. It was the first thing anyone had offered her in the constant tower that didn't come with contracts or conditions or tests. "Do you regret it?" she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Binding me." Constantine went still in that way he had, that total absence of movement that reminded her he wasn't human, that breathing and fidgeting and all the small unconscious motions people made were things he'd learned to mimic but didn't need. He considered the question, his dark eyes on hers. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I don't regret that it was you." Then he left, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click, and Maya was alone again with tea and bread and the ghost of kindness hanging in the air. She locked the deadbolt, heard it slide home with a solid thunk, then returned to the table and poured tea into one of the mismatched cups. It was black tea, strong and plain, and when she sipped it the heat spread through her chest and made her realize how cold she'd been. She tore off a piece of bread, dipped it in honey, and ate. It tasted like the first real food she'd had in days, better than anything from the diner, better than the protein bars she'd been living on in her apartment. She ate 3 slices, drank 2 cups of tea, and felt her body start to remember that it needed fuel, that survival required more than just staying on your feet. The room was warm, the bed looked soft, and Maya thought about sleeping, about letting the exhaustion pull her under and dealing with everything else tomorrow. She set the empty cup down and was reaching for the lamp when her phone buzzed. The sound was loud in the quiet room, harsh and intrusive, and Maya froze. Her phone was on the dresser where she'd left it, screen lighting up with a notification. She'd assumed the tower would block signals, that the glass and steel and whatever else the building was made of would cut her off from the outside world, but apparently not. She picked up the phone, saw a text from an unknown number, no area code, just a string of digits that didn't follow any pattern she recognized. The message was short. "You're the experiment. He's the variable. When he breaks the covenant to save you, they'll have the proof they need to end him. Sleep well, little spark." The screen went dark. Maya stared at the black glass, her reflection faint in its surface, her face pale and drawn. She read the message again, the words rearranging themselves in her head, forming connections she didn't want to see. "You're the experiment, not Constantine's experiment, not his proof or his symbol, someone else's. She was bait." The realization hit like cold water, sharp and clarifying. She wasn't here to prove the covenant still had meaning. She was here to prove it didn't, to force Constantine into a position where he'd have to choose between upholding the law and protecting her. And when he chose her, when he broke his own rules to keep her alive, it would give his enemies everything they needed to destroy him. He's the variable. They were testing him, not her. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, phone clutched in her hand, and thought through the past 3 days. The boy at the bus stop had been Constantine's test, his way of finding a human who still acted from kindness instead of calculation. But what if someone else had been watching that test, waiting to see who passed, waiting to see who Constantine would choose to bind? What if the entire setup, the covenant reciprocity, the formal introduction, the poisoned wine, all of it was designed to create a situation where Constantine's attachment to her would grow strong enough that he'd sacrifice everything to protect her? When he breaks the covenant to save you, not if, when. They were counting on it. Maya stood, paced the length of the room, her mind racing. The purists wanted proof he'd grown weak. The modernists wanted proof the covenant was impossible to maintain. The silent court took contracts from anyone with payment. All 3 factions would benefit if Constantine violated the very law he was trying to uphold, if his protection of her became the thing that proved the covenant was dead. "Sleep well, little spark." The phrase felt like mockery, like whoever sent the message knew exactly what they'd set in motion and found it amusing. Maya looked at the door Constantine had just exited, thought about him bringing her tea and bread with no ceremony or expectation, thought about the way he'd said, "I don't regret that it was you." He didn't know. Or if he knew there was a larger game being played, he didn't know she was the centerpiece, the loaded gun being aimed at his head. She should tell him, warn him that protecting her was exactly what his enemies wanted, that every time he stepped between her and danger he was giving them ammunition. But if she told him, what would he do? Send her away, break the binding, prove that he valued survival over principle? That would also destroy the covenant, would prove it was just words on old paper with no real power. She was trapped. They were both trapped. The message had made that clear. There was no winning move, no clever solution that kept her alive and Constantine's reputation intact and the covenant valid. Someone had engineered a situation where every choice led to the same ending. Maya sat on the floor again, her back against the bed, phone in her lap. The room's white walls felt like they were closing in. The windows showed only darkness. The silence after Constantine's departure had been total, peaceful, but the text's arrival had broken it like glass, shattered the brief moment of safety into sharp pieces. Outside, the city glittered. Somewhere in it, people were sleeping in their beds, worrying about rent and relationships and work, normal human problems that didn't involve ancient laws and vampire politics and being used as bait in a trap you couldn't escape. Maya envied them with an intensity that made her chest ache. She looked at the tea tray, at the chipped teapot and the honey jar, and the evidence of Constantine's small kindness. She thought about the $20, about giving it away because it was the right thing to do, even when she couldn't afford it. She thought about drinking the poisoned wine because being a prop was worse than being dead. She thought about the pattern of her choices, the way she kept choosing principle over survival, and wondered if that was exactly what whoever sent the message was counting on. Little Spark. The nickname felt deliberate, designed to make her feel small and powerless, a tiny flame that would ignite something much larger and burn itself out in the process. Maya set her phone on the table, face down so she wouldn't have to see the screen. She pulled a blanket from the bed and wrapped it around her shoulders. She didn't turn off the lamp. She sat on the floor of her white room in the Constant Tower and watched the door and waited for dawn that wouldn't come for hours, her mind turning over questions that had no good answers. Who sent the message? How did they get her number? How long had they been planning this? And the biggest question, the one that made her stomach turn, how did she warn Constantine that saving her would destroy him without proving to everyone watching that she was exactly the weakness they believed her to be? The clock in her phone ticked over to 2 in the morning. Maya didn't sleep. She sat and thought and planned and tried to find the angle, the way out, the move that broke the trap instead of springing it. Outside, the city glittered like a circuit board, lights and lives and possibilities. Inside the tower, Maya felt the walls close in and understood with cold clarity that she'd walked into a war that had been waiting for someone exactly like her, someone who'd give $20 to a stranger and drink poison to prove a point, someone reckless enough and principled enough to be the spark that burned down everything Constantine had spent 300 years building. The phone stayed dark on the table. The message stayed undeleted in her inbox. And somewhere in the tower or the city beyond, someone was waiting to see what she'd do next, waiting to see if the experiment would yield the results they needed, waiting for the variable to break and the proof to emerge and the covenant to fall. Maya pulled the blanket tighter and watched the door and didn't sleep, because sleeping meant dreaming, and dreaming meant processing, and processing meant accepting that she'd become a weapon being aimed at the one person who'd tried to protect her. And she wasn't ready to accept that yet. Not yet. Not while there was still time to find another way. The lamp burned. The city glittered. The clock ticked toward dawn. And Maya sat in her white room holding questions she couldn't answer and feeling the weight of every choice she'd made since giving $20 to a crying child, feeling the shape of the trap closing around both of them, and wondering if kindness was always this expensive, or if she'd just been unlucky enough to be kind to exactly the right person at exactly the wrong time.